in the mid 90s, they developed the GMO seed that is nicknamed Roundup Ready. So they sold the system of the GMO seed and then the Roundup as a package, and farmers were kind of stuck using it.
And of course, this is where we started to see these cresting rates of chronic disease starting right around 1996.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together.
Okay, Kelly Ryerson, welcome to the Commune podcast. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk with you because the topic of glyphosate has come up in almost every conversation I have on this show, from functional medicine doctors, the gastroenterologists, soil and agronomy experts, regenerative farmers. But I've never done an episode really dedicated to this particular compound and issue. And it really is a topic that spans soil health, planetary health, plant health, nutrition, human health. It touches all of these elements. And I can't imagine a better person to educate on this matter than you, Kelly. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Oh, thank you. I'm thrilled that more people are talking about it. That's a good sign. I'm glad that it's becoming a famous chemical.
Yeah, I feel like we're at this inflection point right now where it has come into the zeitgeist like never before. And a lot of that is thanks to the work that you're doing and the advocacy that you're doing and other folks like Zach and Zach Bush, who's been on the show quite a bit, and Stephanie Seneff, who's been working on this for a decade. But there's just so much terrain to cover when you get, no pun intended, when describing what glyphosate is, where it's not, might be a better question, and all of its impacts. So before we get into that, perhaps we can scaffold the conversation with a bit of your personal biography, because your activism around glyphosate really has its provenance in your own personal health journey. So maybe we could begin by you describing just how your own personal health battles propelled you into this crusade
Sure.
against glyphosate.
Yeah. So I, I had a relatively normal, healthy life for years, most of my life. And when I hit my 30s, I started getting some really strange symptoms and really vague symptoms. And it actually led me to kind of be a hypochondriac because, when you have several things going on at once and you don't know anything about functional medicine, what you end up doing is you go to the doctor a lot and you're like, okay, why are my hands constantly tingling? Why do I get these strange rashes all over the place? And why am I so tired? Aches and pains, just various ailments that didn't seem normal and certainly not normal for me. And so I saw as I say, it was just a broad spectrum of different symptoms, really everything under the sun, and including my eyesight was kind of going, my hair was starting to fall out. But this was over the course of, several years. And so I'm having brain MRI and all these typical things that, that people do. And it all looked okay. And so I was told that it was a psychological issue and that, all these ailments I'm having, I'm just kind of creating, and maybe I should, dedicate more time to some hobbies and my career and try and get my mind off of my health problems. And so that was really offensive. And in the meantime, I was put on several different drugs, two psychiatric, two antidepressants, one anti-anxiety, and various courses of steroids because I was inflamed. And finally I thought, well, maybe I am crazy. And so I went to see a psychiatrist, and I was very sick. At this point I could actually barely walk, but I didn't have, I had some inflammation markers, but there was still no specific diagnosis as to why I was so ill. And so I went to the psychiatrist who happened to have this intake blood work, and it had some vitamin levels on it. And when the test came back, I was floored because I was so deficient across the board in so many critical vitamins. And so, like, literally coming home, and this was probably now 6 years ago or 7 years ago, and I was putting in to like Google, I'm like, okay, so B12 deficiency, does that really do anything? And my Western doctor's like, oh, a lot of people are deficient in that. They couldn't be that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, but I have barely any. So that opened up my eyes to, okay, something really fundamental is going on here. This makes me think that I'm not absorbing my nutrients. And I tried giving up gluten, and it was miraculous. I had my inflammation just came rapidly down within, a month or so. And then the healing continued over the next year, because obviously then I had to use the supplements to get the minerals and nutrients back in my body and start just completely revamping my diet. So that was a big eye opener, and kind of opened this whole thing and whole journey now I've been on in trying to uncover what it is and, what's the root cause of what happened to me. It's happening to so many people at like an accelerating rate. Why is chronic disease going through the roof? Why aren't we questioning it more? Because it shouldn't be now normal that our kids even are having chronic disease at early ages. And, so that's what started me on my journey.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. What we have become to accept as normal, I might argue, is patently abnormal.
Absolutely.
Because, you describe your journey, and I listened to you, and I have a lot of empathy for your journey. And at the same time, it sounds like a lot of people that I know. All of these kind of vague symptoms, kind of general autoimmunity. And then obviously you can look at cresting rates of chronic disease and specific autoimmune diseases. And a lot of us are just kind of scratching our heads as like, how do we get to the bottom of this? How do we not just endlessly treat the symptoms with another kind of polypharma solution? But how do we get to, move upstream, as you say, and try to identify some of the root causes? So can you describe a little bit about how you began to kind of pinpoint and identify glyphosate as one of the primary players or contributors to this scourge of chronic disease?
Yeah. So when I found out that I don't tolerate gluten, but am not celiac, I went to a conference at Columbia, and it was a gluten conference on celiac and gluten sensitivity. And a scientist stood up in the front of the room, and he's like, so we don't know what it is. We actually don't know that it's exactly the gliadin protein that's within gluten that's causing this inflammation. We think maybe there's something else on the grain. And so I asked, I was totally new to it. And I was like, well, do they spray anything? Like, do they spray Roundup on the grain? And no one in the audience, they like turn around, and doctors are like, what? They don't spray Roundup. That would kill it. And I'm like, okay, maybe I'm wrong. It was in the back of my mind. And so I sat down, and then one of the lead scientists for General Mills found me, and he said, yeah, well, they're spraying Roundup all over the wheat and all over the grain to desiccate it, to dry it. And so we know there's a problem, but it's going to take 2 decades to fix this issue of using Roundup as a harvest aid. And I'm like, well, don't you think that might have something to do with this huge epidemic of gluten sensitivity? And he's like, oh, well, I mean, it's supposedly non-toxic. So, I don't know. So anyway, they were on it, but I was like, okay. So my eyes just like were wide open. Immediately I was like on PubMed, which is, for those who don't know, it's a database that we were just actually talking about off record, like about how, you can read all this published research there, and it's fascinating. And if you want to learn more science about these specific issues, it's a great resource. And so the first person who I called was Stephanie Seneff, Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who, uh, and she has been just so outspoken and wonderfully outspoken for many years on this before anyone was talking about it. And she very graciously met with me at MIT and told me about like the rough road it is fighting these chemicals and what she'd been through, and really launched me into a lot of interest in this. So and if anyone, she's published a book now on it and everything, and it's just wonderful because she just so eloquently lays out all the issues that are with this chemical. And as you said in the intro, it is phenomenal because it just impacts so much of the ecosystem, in our human bodies, all around the globe. Just it literally is everywhere. And so then light bulbs are going off in my mind. Okay, so what is this not impacting? Well, very little, but no one's talking about it because it's been hidden by industry. So it's been fascinating.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into where it is, which is essentially proliferated through our entire food system, but also, Stephanie, for example, postulates that it may be in the air due to the use of biofuels in some parts of the country, particularly in the Northeast. So it is pervasive in every measure. But perhaps we can do a little bit of glyphosate 101 for people that are new to this. So you had a vague sense that glyphosate was this active ingredient in this particular herbicide known as Roundup. Can you spend a few minutes kind of describing glyphosate, what it is, and primarily how it is used both commercially and for intensive conventional agriculture?
Yeah. So glyphosate is a chemical that was originally used before it was used as an herbicide pesticide. It was used as a boiler, like a pipe cleaner, because it has these very specific qualities of being able to chelate and bind to heavy metals. So, and not just heavy metals, just minerals and metals. And so that is an excellent way to be able to clean out a pipe that's corroded with all of these things. So, it would collect it and you'd clean it on out. And then a scientist realized, oh, wait, this has really powerful herbicidal properties. So it's really miraculous because of its mechanism of action. It goes into a plant and it shuts down some key energy pathways in the plant, and then the plant dies. So they said, and what's wonderful about this is that humans don't have these pathways. So it's not going to impact humans if they come in contact with it. So that was the idea, and they put it together with something called a surfactant, which is a soapy substance that helps to get the glyphosate into the plant, and it kind of sticks and coats the outside of a leaf, and which is very toxic in and of itself. But we'll just focus on just the glyphosate component for now. And they put that together and then created the well-known herbicide Roundup. And they launched that onto the market in the mid 70s. And originally it was just kind of used on the periphery of different like crops and farms and landscapes and, in homes, home landscaping. And then the patent actually was going to be running out in the year 2000 for glyphosate. And Monsanto was the company that owned that patent. And so they realized, okay, we have got to do something if we're going to keep the money coming in from this like top selling herbicide. So in the mid 90s, they developed the GMO seed that is nicknamed Roundup Ready. So you with this Roundup Ready corn, Roundup Ready soy, Roundup Ready cotton, farmers could go in and spray the GMO seed, like the GMO crops, as much as they wanted with this Roundup. It would kill the weeds around it, but because the seeds of these crops were resistant to Roundup, they wouldn't die. So they sold this system of the GMO seed and then the Roundup as a package, and farmers were kind of stuck using it. And it just was explosively profitable for Monsanto, now Bayer, who acquired Monsanto. So today you will see it used on GMO crops, but you also, and most concerningly, from a diet perspective for us, it's predominantly used as a desiccant. So a desiccant is something that is it dries out the crop. So think about a wheat field and taking Roundup and spraying it towards the very end of its growth cycle. And it expedites the drying and the maturity of the crop. And then they can go in and they just are able to process it really easily. There's no concern about like, okay, this part of the crop is mature, this part isn't. So I'll have to do it in two stages. That doesn't happen when you can just spray it all dead and then go and harvest it. So the problem though is that they spray it and then it's on our grain and then it's immediately sent to the mill and then put into our food products. And now we are heavily exposed from a dietary perspective to the glyphosate. And agricultural economist Chuck Benbrook he calculated that over 80% of our exposure to glyphosate through diet is likely through the desiccation process of the crops.
That was such a great and educational history of the product. Now, of course, my initial association with glyphosate was thinking back into the 80s, where there would be those advertisements for Roundup, really geared mostly to men, sort of like the homeowner out there courageously killing weeds in his garden or on his lawn. And, you could strap on this pack of Roundup and almost wield this thing like some sort of strange phallus and kill all of the dandelions and things that would encroach upon this perfect lawn. And of course, glyphosate's water soluble, so it would get into the water and there would be runoff and it would go into local water supplies. So that was detrimental. But I think what you outlined was really like the inflection point in and around 1996 with the development of these Roundup Ready or genetically modified seeds, which basically moved conventional agriculture as it pertains to the use of herbicides away from kind of like spot application to just mass application. And of course, this is where we started to see these cresting rates of chronic disease starting right around 1996. So obviously, correlation is not causation, but correlation can help us to form certain kinds of hypotheses. So maybe we could go into that time period right around 1996 and into the early 2000s, and you could explain the impacts of glyphosate on the soil and on the plants, because we know now that this is a patented antibiotic and antimicrobial. So, at a chemical level, what is happening when farmers started to mass apply glyphosate?
Yeah, and just speaking on, I've spoken to a lot of farmers who still farm GMO seeds, and they use Roundup, and they're very defensive of their choices naturally because they've committed themselves to it. So I'm sympathetic to them and empathetic to an extent because I understand the economic situation that they're in now because they're fully dependent on this chemical. And very sadly, their property and their really healthy soil has been destroyed by it. And I'm sure that it's not lost on them because they have been tending land, for generations in many cases. So, but what I witnessed while touring various GMO farms is just the complete destruction of the soil. Like the soil that's in these fields isn't really even soil anymore. It's like converted into a hard clay that has no life in it anymore. And like the way I describe what the soil is like in elementary school when you get to build a sculpture and you're like all given a slab of clay. And it's like that. It's like moldable chemical, but probably much more dangerous to touch clay. And One of the signs of health in the soil is how many worms are in it, because they're really critical to soil health. And when digging through the soil with a shovel, and if just there were two carcasses of worms that were found in there, and usually it should be just packed with worms, be a really healthy soil, but they can't survive in this chemical situation. And so not only do you have that going on in the soil where, you know, the worms can't survive, but also we have the same situation that, you know, made it such an excellent pipe cleaner, is that it chelates all these key minerals that our body is entirely dependent upon to function. So if the soil doesn't have these minerals, then they're not bioavailable for the crops, so then the crops don't have them. And then when we eat them, we're not getting what we were originally designed to get from the soil. So when I look around and I see these just extraordinary magnesium deficiencies, which I certainly had, and zinc deficiencies, and people like having so many psychological problems with like depression and anxiety and like anger at each other right now. And because I'm root cause based like you, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how much do they need magnesium and zinc so desperately? But the soil doesn't have it anymore because of the specific mechanism of action of glyphosate on the soil. So it's just, I mean, it's really fascinating when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, magnesium is the fourth most popular micronutrient in the body. And as you say, it's so necessary for things like sleep and nervous system regulation and cardiovascular health. So you start to like, scratch your head and say, like, well, why do we have chronic insomnia? Well, there's a lot of, places to point to, chronic stress. Um, certainly we've disrupted our circadian rhythms with access to blue light all the time. But, we have to look at things like, why are we just not getting these core nutrients that we used to get from food? We're just not getting them. And I think like what you said is right on. From what I've read about it, it's a chelator. So it creates these bonds that essentially prohibits the plants from actually absorbing the nutrients from the soil. The other thing you said about earthworms too. I mean, in preparation for speaking with you, I was looking at Nature published a study on earthworms, a highly stringent publication, showing that the application of glyphosate will kill, just in one season, in one application, 50% of the earthworms in the soil. So then you compound that over a couple of years, and what do you get? You get, a soil that's completely devoid of earthworms. So what does that mean? Well, earthworms obviously contribute to the nutrients in the soil, but they also aerate the soil, which is so important for water retention. So of course, we see these epic droughts out there now. And then when it does rain, it just runs right off because there's no retention in the soil.
You get the 5 foot floods, you know, that are pouring through the heartland because none of the soil can absorb it. It's just really stunning.
Yeah, and it's just staggering and honestly really sad because so much of that then glyphosate-ridden soil, that runoff is going into these catchment systems and estuaries, and then ends up in the Mississippi River and comes downstream, and you start to do any kind of analysis of cancer and where cancer is concentrated right now. I mean, we hear about Cancer Alley. Well, it's right, down the banks of the Mississippi, and most efflorescent in around Louisiana. And again, some of these things are just hypotheses, but you begin to kind of put a lot of these puzzle pieces together, and you're like, God, we got to do something.
Oh yeah, so desperately. And you know, also in the soil, of course, is the very critical biome, the soil biome. And as you were mentioning, it is an antibiotic. It's patented by Monsanto as that. Um, and so you think about applying that, and that is such a critical part, once again, of our livelihood, and you know, the basis, the foundations of nature. It's how all of that works together. So then you're spraying antibiotic on that soil, not to mention we're eating it. And, you know, that sort of gets to the next idea about how it impacts our microbiome, of course, quite directly as well.
Yeah, yeah. I want to move into that. I mean, I wanted to just hover maybe a bridge into plant and soil health into human health might be to just probe this particular cellular pathway that exists within plants and bacteria called the shikimate pathway. Can you tell us a little bit about how glyphosate disrupts that particular pathway and why that is so detrimental both to plant health and then to human health?
Yeah. So to keep it relatively simple, and it's interesting because I first learned about this, just to go back. My first foray into the glyphosate world was I was covering the Monsanto cancer trials in by sitting in the courtroom, and so that's how I learned like glyphosate 101. And their lead attorney Brent Wisner described it so beautifully when he said it's like, taking the bullet out of a shotgun or something like that, because like everything that the plant needs to perform, like all these key amino acids that they need, like it's impacted by glyphosate and just stopped, so it can't continue to proliferate. And the shikimate pathway is also fascinatingly present in our microbiome, and so it will shut off these really key pathways that we need to create, different things. That, actually, a lot of what is produced by these bacteria is a lot of the things that regulate sort of our temperament. So once again, it's like, okay, what is happening here? It's like the devastation of our microbiome. And very fascinatingly, so forever Monsanto was saying, oh, this does not impact the human body, and they said safe for humans. Like there's a little label on the bottle,
Yeah.
and then there was a lawsuit just a couple of years ago, and people were fighting. They're like, no, that's not true, because in arguing that the microbiome is part of the human body, and Monsanto had to take that off of their claims that it doesn't impact the human body. So, yay for the microbiome on behalf of them.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you bring up the microbiome because I talk about it so much on this show and have interviewed a lot of functional medicine doctors and gastroenterologists. And, as I started to delve a little bit deeper into like the shikimate pathway, for example. So that particular pathway, among other things, produces these essential amino acids. So essential amino acids are essentially amino acids that our bodies don't make endogenously. We have to get them exogenously in diet. Um, so some of these essential amino acids, there's 9 of them. One of them is tryptophan, and another one is phenylalanine. And it's amazing, actually, that you bring it up with our microbiome because our bacteria can actually also produce those amino acids, which is just kind of
It's so
fascinating
amazing.
and brilliant.
Yeah.
and and if you look at tryptophan, for example, specifically, tryptophan is the antecedent for serotonin, which is made by Streptococcus and I think Enterococcus, these two kind of different bacteria that exist in the gut. And I think 90% of our serotonin is produced in the gut. So if you block these pathways that then produce the essential amino acids like tryptophan, and tryptophan is the antecedent for things like serotonin. Well, we know serotonin is highly associated with mood regulation, and it's this kind of feel good neurotransmitter. And then all of a sudden, we have a whole class of drugs called SSRIs,
Yes.
selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that try to keep serotonin in the system. And you're like, but wait a minute, we just actually crippled the production of it in our bodies through blocking this particular pathway. So it's
Oh
like,
my gosh, it's so mind blowing. And I was looking for a long time for data on the sales and rise of the purchase of SSRIs, because I have a strong suspicion that it too would like correlate very closely with that. And interestingly, like it's actually really hard data to find, and I wonder why.
yeah, well, this is what we have to, citizen scientists unite, right? This is what
Right.
we need to figure out because, we've started to put together this, correlation oriented data around, okay, the over application of herbicides like glyphosate with chronic disease, with autism, and then you just start to continue to pull that thread. Okay, now we're looking at epidemic levels of depression, mental illness, and why. Okay, yeah, you can point your fingers to a whole different variety of things, definitely social media and stress, but are there other elements at play here? And when you start to do some of the biochemical analysis, anyways, and you realize that there are particular cellular pathways that are blocked, as you've described, and those cellular pathways are absolutely integral to certain compounds and neurotransmitters and chemical processes in your body, it's not just a bunch of hot air. These are, science-based analyses.
And I really actually take issue with a lot of people that say, well, it's the times right now. It's such like anxious times, and that's what's causing it. And like then you think through like history and world wars and like all this stuff, and it wasn't an epidemic. Like it wasn't like it is. So when you're at a cocktail party and you want to bring that up, you can get people pretty quiet quickly.
True. Well, as I was kind of poking at this more, phenylalanine, which is another essential amino acid that's blocked by that is not getting produced when you're blocking or disrupting the shikimate pathway, that is the antecedent for dopamine. So, so you're like, and which is obviously central to the brain's reward system and a mood regulator. So when you're blocking these pathways and you start to realize, well, I've blocked, production of dopamine, of serotonin also happens to be the precursor of melatonin, which helps to, which helps our sleeping patterns. And we know how important sleep is, for a panoply of reasons. Then you're like, God, yeah. So talk a little bit about some of the other knock-on impacts in the gut as it pertains to glyphosate and dysbiosis and what has become known as leaky gut, because I think this is a huge part of the equation.
This is such a huge, huge part that very few people. I mean, recently, with thanks to Zach and Dr. Bush and Dr. Hyman talking about it, is bringing it more to the forefront. But when I first learned about gut dysbiosis and leaky gut, I was going regularly to the Institute of Functional Medicine conferences every year and trying to learn.
Mm.
And I was so annoyed because they would talk ad nauseum about what the mechanisms are for, leaky gut, the explosion in autoimmunity, dysbiosis, and the whole gamut. And they would never mention the clearest route. And I still to this day don't understand why, unless they're really worried about making Bayer mad or Monsanto mad, because it's very obvious. And I even Dr. Fasano, who is a scientist who discovered sort of how leaky gut happens, and he like proved it, and he's so impressive and so cool. And I really enjoyed hearing him speak. And, I even asked him and I was like, well, do you think that there's an issue here? And he said, well, yes, but, and, he can only say so much because that his funding is going to be limited because industry is going to be having a really tight control on that. And you go to the celiac. I went to a celiac conference, and they're not willing to mention it either. And I bring it up each time. And what's so crazy about it is it's not only the glyphosate in this case too. It's also the surfactant, and it's called POEA, and it is a surfactant that actually is not allowed to be used in Europe. So their formulation of Roundup is considerably less toxic than ours. And which is so upsetting because that they're able to manufacture two different types, but for whatever reason, the US is like, fine, just send your poisons our way. We don't mind eating them. We're fine. Um, so that is extremely toxic and carcinogenic in and of itself. But of course, the glyphosate as well, coming in and creating this havoc. So it tends to kill our beneficial bacteria, and potentiate the less desirable bacteria. So some of the more pathogenic bacteria are able to resist its effects. So things like E. coli are able to proliferate. And so then you have this real disaster in the microbiome of a lack of beneficial bacteria. And the combination of the glyphosate, as well as just this mucosal disruption and gluten, actually, in many cases, will
Hmm.
really encourage this. To keep it like kind of high level, it really encourages this leaky gut, basically. That toxins are going into the bloodstream that shouldn't be there.
You can get geeky. It's cool if to get geeky if you want to get geeky because
Okay, yeah. It potentiates the tight junctions, and and so it potentiates like the zonulin, and the zonulin goes and opens up the tight junctions, and so it's that combination that then lets all these toxins just out of your intestine and into the bloodstream, wreaking havoc and creating this autoimmune um, situation. And it doesn't just end in the gut, because now new research has come out that's proven that it also it breaks through the blood brain barrier. It goes in and can cause neurodegeneration, and a lot of scientists are looking to see what that exact impact is. I mean, that's pretty scary, but actually more terrifying to me is this connection with endocrine disruption. And it's really, it's crippling our ability to reproduce, because specifically it crosses the blood testes barrier, and it leads to early sperm death. And we know it also goes into the developing fetus of baby girls, and it impacts the eggs. And I actually decided I wanted to see just how impacted my daughter was, and so I sent her baby tooth in to the lab to see if there was glyphosate in it. It was there. So you think, okay, it's in her baby tooth that was formed in utero. So where else did this go? Certainly throughout her body. Um, so
Yeah, wow. That's shocking. I mean, I know, for example, there's particular bacteria in our guts when we're just infants, like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, that are the good bugs in our gut that can be adversely impacted by concentrations of glyphosate. But we need those bacteria, for example, to digest breast milk. So when we're compromised early in life, and as you say, obviously there's something that's like this particular chemical is being passed down in utero. So we are compromising, um, our children's well-being, through the ingestion of this particular chemical, and that's really, um, it should make us all just uh, take heed, because it's not just our own health too; it's the health of our progeny.
no, there are studies that are showing that it's the real impacts aren't even showing up in the first generation. So say, like, am I the first? Yeah, I would be, the first generation. I have my babies. It's not showing up there so much as it is in the grandkids and the great grandkids in the rodent studies. So, we're kind of waiting to see what the Roundup babies, look like in the coming generations.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we haven't even crossed into any kind of analysis, kind of epigenetic analysis there of like our genes becoming methylated through exposure to this particular chemical, such that our gene expression not only changes in our own lives, but are we passing down those methylation markers to our progeny, and what is that going to look like? So that's a little, it's beyond my pay grade, but it's a little scary
It's
to
really
think about.
scary. And the Dr. Shauna Swan, who I've had the opportunity to talk with a lot of times, and she's so fascinating. She wrote the book Countdown, and it talks about the rise of infertility and the environmental toxins that are causing it. It's not just glyphosate, of course. There are plenty of other toxins for us to worry about. But a specific study that she did that I find fascinating is one that a group of, it wasn't just her, a group of researchers, they tested the urinary levels of glyphosate in pregnant women. and they tested them in the second trimester. And then they measured the distance between the anus and the vagina in the female babies to see if there's any correlation. And they found that that distance got longer in correlation with how much glyphosate the mother had in her urine. And so that's androgenization. And you have to be very delicate about talking about this area because you can witness a bit of that in society, and how much of that is social, how much of that is not, how much of it is chemical. It's really a hard thing to figure out, but from the research is showing that physically these changes are happening, and certainly testosterone levels are coming down, and these physical changes are happening. And um, glyphosate has also been connected with a higher likelihood of miscarriage. So it's definitely getting in there and messing up our endocrine systems and reproductive systems. Just terrifying. I mean, it's like I feel like the Grim Reaper when I talk about these things, and I don't want to be, but it's like, oh my gosh, pay attention. This is bad. It has to stop.
Yeah, well, there are some bright spots on the horizon, and we'll get to some brighter spots, some areas of hope, because I do think that there is some awakening around this topic. Um, uh, but I think one point that really I can't underscore enough, and you explained it beautifully, is the connection between glyphosate and intestinal permeability. And I just can't overemphasize or emphasize enough that particular phenomenon, because what we're seeing right now are epidemic levels of chronic inflammation in our systems that are really the substrate for so many different chronic diseases. And what that is it's the immune system being over agitated. And if you kind of go upstream from that, well, why is that happening? Well, through a whole different combination or sort of cocktail of inputs from sugar and processed foods and refined grains and refined sugars and NSAIDs and PPIs and over prescription of antibiotics and environmental toxins. But certainly glyphosate is playing a central role in this. What you said is the tight junctions, the barrier in that epithelium that separates our gut from our immune system and our bloodstream is breaking down, and essentially endotoxins or lipopolysaccharides or kind of the broken down walls of bacteria are kind of passing through that barrier, and that is activating or triggering this immune response. And that would be okay if it just happened every once in a while, but we're in a chronic state of that. And so our immune system is in sort of agita. And, and obviously this inflammation travels then throughout the whole body and can be kind of, I guess what I would call it sort of the substrate for so many of these different chronic diseases. So, I've struggled personally with rebuilding my gut. And so that one is one that hits home for me, and I think hits home for you too. Yeah.
It's a lot of guess and check for me because there are just so many things that are out there that I've tried in terms of healing my gut. And you know, it would be so nice if the answer maybe could just be, well, we'll just eat really well, but it seems like a lot of times more than that is necessary.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of protocols that we can adopt, and maybe we can touch on a few to protect the liver and feed the gut. That's Robert Lustig's moniker, if you will. Um, but I want to bring up one more hypothesis that I first read about through the work of Stephanie Seneff, who we referred to, which has to do with glycine, which is another amino acid, which is sort of the precursor for glutathione. So glutathione is obviously a fairly celebrated antioxidant right now, and at the mitochondrial level can protect us from a lot of oxidative stress. But one of the theories or hypotheses that Stephanie's put out there is that the chemical formula for glyphosate is so similar to the chemical makeup of glycine that glyphosate is essentially mucking up our body's ability to generate glutathione, and leading to a lot of oxidative stress. I don't know if you've heard her talk about that at all, or if you have any
I
thoughts on
have
that.
just a little bit, and I didn't look into it in great detail, but I did, you know, I did wonder about that correlation between it being very buzzy right now, a lack of it, and what's changed. That was sort of my conclusion on that front. And I mean, everything that she seems to come out with, like, well, that seems like that could be sensible.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about your experience with the Dwayne Lee Johnson case, because I think that was a huge entry point for you. And um, it's so interesting just from a story perspective. And I think it also represents, at least for me, one of the brighter lights in the glyphosate saga. So, do you mind sharing a little bit about what the Dwayne Lee Johnson case was and how you became involved?
Yeah. I mean, it's so crazy I became involved in that, because after I came back from that original conference at Columbia and I was so upset about Roundup, I was like, oh my gosh. And so I'm looking it up, and I'm like, oh my gosh, in San Francisco, which is where I live, I'm like, there is a trial that's happening just in a few weeks. It's the first time Monsanto's been brought on trial in front of a jury. So, like, very exciting. And so I went up to protest Monsanto because I assumed in in San Francisco there'd be protests, but no, walked right in, sat right down with the lawyers. Um, and I
Where
was
all
like,
the hippies? Where all the hippies go?
where did they go? I guess they can't afford to live in San Francisco because none were there. It was very, very sad and disappointing. It would have been my very first protest. So, um, and there were some journalists that were there the first day, and then it petered out in terms of who was covering it. And I was like, my gosh, this is so critical. I remember talking to the CBS journalists. I'm like, no, you have to be covering this. You don't realize it's like vital to the future of humanity. And I mean, I still feel that way. I do. And like, it finally was bringing this attention of glyphosate in this context, cancer, but whatever context it needs to be. Um, and so Dwayne Johnson, well, to finish that story, I ended up staying and blogging every day and telling some stories about it. And so Dwayne Johnson, he was a pesticide applicator at public school district in California. And he was very exposed to Roundup topically. Like, he had some spills from his backpack on his skin. And, but, he wore the protective clothing that actually they don't require you to wear, but he did. And it went through and saturated him. And he very shortly thereafter actually came down with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, or developed it. And so the trial was exploring the carcinogenicity of glyphosate. So it was multifold. So, could this cause cancer? Did the company know that it could cause cancer? And the answers are both yes and yes. And epidemiologists and toxicologists all presented their evidence, and it really floored me. Not so much that this causes cancer. So I'm like, well, clearly when they're showing this research, I'm like, yes, this causes cancer. And the only response that Monsanto had was, well, the EPA says it doesn't. So it doesn't, and we're not liable. Like, that was sort of the constant response. And so, that was shocking, in that I was someone that fully trusted our regulatory system at that point. And I mean, I don't know why. That makes me feel stupid, because now I know so much more about our regulators and how completely bought they are by corporations. But at the time, that was really stunning to me, that they would allow something that they know that causes cancer. Their own EPA scientists have said that it causes cancer, and they're still to this day allowing it to be sprayed and letting people like Lee Johnson, and of course over 100,000 other plaintiffs suffer with cancer as a result of it.
No, I was going to say, though, I suppose the good news was, though, that the jury did render a relatively historic verdict. Isn't that right?
Yeah, so that was phenomenal. The first verdict. Then there was a second trial that went. It was a federal trial, and it also won. And then a third one, and that was the $2 billion settlement, or award, rather. That isn't what it ended up being. That was too much. It was brought down. But the what I loved about the $2 billion one is that someone internal at Monsanto, when in this discovery documents, they were emailing about how finding glyphosate to be a carcinogen would be $1 billion problem. And so there were two plaintiffs. And so they're like, what would be appropriate? We know. so but what also was fantastic about those trials is that this attention suddenly was paid to glyphosate and was finally making headlines. And I think though at that point and still today most people still think of it as just being sold on at Home Depot and unfortunately at Target, which I've argued with them about. But I don't think most people realize that this is spread on all of our food and we're eating it every day. They just think of it as something you can buy and use in your backyard.
Right. And of course, a lot of the GMO crops are used for feed on concentrated animal feeding operations or CAFOs. So it's not just on our fruits and vegetables, it's also in all industrial meat products as well, because of course, cattle and pigs and chickens, they're eating GMO food, which is sprayed at the crop level by glyphosate.
And I even asked a GMO farmer, as because so one of the things that you'll hear that the food industry will say in GMO industry and like the USDA and FDA is like we have to feed the world, and the only way we can feed the world is if we use these chemicals and GMOs. So that's how they defend them. Otherwise, we'll all starve. And have you heard that?
Oh yeah. Oh sure. Yeah,
They're
yeah, yeah.
banners.
That's the big excuse is like, how are we going to feed 10 billion people?
Well, totally. And so he's telling me this because that's what he's been sold. And I was like, so then I'm like, so can you break down the proportions of where your crops are going to go? And, this huge chunk is going to feed the meat industry. And I'm like, so it's not feed the world because you're eating just like, I think it's something like 10% of the corn goes to human consumption. And that's just in refined, high fructose corn syrup and that kind of thing. But this huge, massive amount is just going to feed animals. So it's feeding the world meat. And he's like, yeah, that's right. I'm like, okay, well, it's so sad. And then you go and you visit. I don't know if you've been able to go see these capos, but I mean, it's horrific. It's so sad. These animals are so sick.
They're sick. Well, of course, they all have intestinal permeability. All the cattle have leaky gut as well.
Yeah.
So they're also in a hyper cortisol infused, hyper inflamed state. So when we're eating industrial farmed meat, we're eating sick meat.
And like, I just remember looking at this line of cattle and like just mucus pouring out of their nose. And they're so sick. They probably also have antibiotics and stuff. They're trying to control that. But yeah, super leaky.
Yeah. Well, of course, the antibiotics only serves to further undermine the plethora of healthy bacteria in their gut. So really, I mean, this is macabre, but the application of antibiotics, there's an argument to be made there, is really they're not really trying to protect the cows. They're actually just trying to fatten them up quicker, because we know when we break down the systems of the gut, basically you become insulin resistant. So when you become insulin resistant, your cells don't use glucose, is what they're eating, because they're eating grains. You're not using that for energy production. You're storing it as fat. So they fatten them up as quickly as possible. And this is what, short-term profits are about. And it's hard because it's hard to point your finger at individuals per se, because there's a lot of folks that are just working hard to put food on the table for their families. It's just that these systems and structures that we've created have so many misaligned incentives, and they externalize so many of the true costs. I mean, we're talking about a $4 trillion annual sick care expense to deal with chronic disease. And that's just where we are now. But I mean, I've seen estimates, going 5-10 years in the future where we're talking like 3-4x that amount. It'll bankrupt the country, basically.
Absolutely. And, um, I would love to talk a little bit about this White House Conference on Nutrition.
Yeah, please do.
the White House Conference on Nutrition isn't addressing the chemical components that are being added to our food system and all these toxicants that we know cause endocrine disruption. They cause leaky gut. They cause like this dysbiosis. They potentially are causing infertility and miscarriages. And they're not willing to address that component of our food system. Then I feel like it's missing more than half of the story of nutrition in the United States right now. So it's just disappointing to see.
Yeah, I mean, I share your frustration there. We talked a little bit about this one particular issue in California with insulin we before we pressed record, where there's a lot of good intentions. For example, around that particular bill, where Newsom signed a bill for California to produce its own insulin to be able to keep insulin prices low for people who are suffering from diabetes, and of course, that's a well-intentioned bill, but it doesn't address the upstream question of, well, why do we have such rampant diabetes in the first place? So, for a conference on nutrition or a conference on food, obviously we're all excited about that. It's so enheartening to see, like senators like Cory Booker get behind, some of these issues that I think a lot of us are really fighting for. But then to have a well-intentioned conference miss such a critical component of the problem, it's a bit frustrating. I mean, especially for you, because I know that you've worked so hard on it.
And like, and I'm with you. Like, I don't think the intentions are bad in this case. I just think it's not on the radar. And so my constant question is, okay, so how do we get this on the radar? Because there's so many competing issues, like certainly in DC, that are really equally pressing. But I would be happy to go and debate why this is one of the most pressing things facing the future of our country.
I completely agree with you. I mean, I think that the inflammation that we see in our public discourse is a direct reflection of the inflammation that we're having inside of our
Oh my
bodies.
gosh, Jeff, it's exactly it.
And I don't want to get mired into a political conversation, and we could have that at some other point. But when you see the invective that exists in the political world, and then you kind of again try to move upstream, and you think about half of the country that is suffering from a chronic disease, or in certain communities, we're talking about 80% of a population suffering from obesity, cardiometabolic disease or dysfunction, diabetes, and then those same folks can't access quality health care or can't afford to get insulin. You wonder why people are so angry, are so frustrated. And this spills over, obviously, into our public discourse. I mean, we have to really examine why we are not healthy as a society. And I think if we did, a lot of our problems would go away, and we could, go back to sort of, disagreeing without being so disagreeable all the time.
Completely. And I've been waiting for a leader to step up and just make these points, at least a DC leader. We have leaders within the movement, but it's certainly not mainstream. Yet I do think that the average citizen learning about this, you know, people outside of our wellness world, they'd be shocked and really disappointed. And I come back to the kids a lot because my own kids had issues before they were gluten free and organic. And, I am often school teachers will reach out to me and they'll be DMing me on Instagram about how half of their kids are clearly, really struggling with inflammation and ADHD and, the stomach issues.
Mm-hmm.
Crohn's disease is an epidemic in small kids, of course, because it's in the gut. And how horrible for those teachers. No wonder why so many like are opting not to be teachers anymore. It's just so infectious in so many different systems.
Yeah. Well, the good news, or a little bit of the good news, I was looking online at all of the countries that have banned the use of glyphosate over the last few years. And it is a growing list. I mean, what I found, at least most recently, was 32 countries, including Mexico, Germany, France, Denmark, Brazil. Some are in the course of phasing it out. Some of it have banned use completely. And then, I know I live in LA. So in July 2019, the LA County Board of Supervisors formally banned Roundup in LA County. And I believe that is also true.
I just wonder how much they hold to it.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know. I don't know what the compliance is. But, there are other cities, Austin, Portland, Miami. So hopefully some of the work that, you're doing is paying off. And I agree with you. I always come back to my children as well. I have 3 daughters, and I try to imagine, what kind of world that they're going to inherit, it just goes to sort of, I guess, bolster, my commitment to trying to spread information about health issues. And I think, you're at the tip of the spear, Kelly, with your advocacy and your work. I know, how many people listen to you, and I know your work is having tremendous impact. And I think people really trust you because you don't have any misaligned incentives. You're just an engaged citizen. I mean, maybe your only misaligned incentives is wanting a better world for your children, which I would hardly call misaligned. So I'm just really grateful for your work, and I hope that we can find ways to work together to, to create more advocates around this important work.
Oh yeah, I would love that. That would be wonderful. Thanks so much for giving me an opportunity.
Yeah, well, to be continued, and I really hope to be able to commune with you in 3 dimensions. So maybe we'll take it offline, but I could imagine a thought leader symposium where we're connecting important folks and influential folks around this issue. I think that could be a good project for us.
Oh, that would be phenomenal. More voices and more coming together, which is clearly like your skill, which is fantastic. We were talking offline about that. Like, it just, the more we can work together, because this is a group project, the better.
Cool. All right, Kelly Ryerson, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.